I feel humble in front of what will be shared. My dear friends, it was precisely the topic that Mickey proposed that I should share with you. Ignatian spirituality as a way of living for all, that attracted me to be here to share this with you. I say this because in accompanying people on a personal level, I have come to discover that there are certain vital elements in Ignatian spirituality that are essential for any person who would like to unfold towards a fullness of life, which ultimately is life lived in God. I will be focusing on 5 points, which are like living streams that help nourish this process of life unto its fullness. I draw these points primarily from the life experience of Ignatius, because any spirituality is first lived before it is in some way articulated or shared. Moreover, based on his life experience, Ignatius composed the spiritual exercises in order to help others to come to experience, each one in his or her unique way, what was so liberating and life-giving for him. So I will be basing what I say on the spiritual exercises, the experience of which is foundational for any person who wants to enter upon the Ignatian path of life. I will also at times be referring to what has come to be known as the autobiography of Saint Ignatius, where we find what towards the end of his life he narrated to one of his companions as how he felt God dealt with him in his life. Where does what we call Ignatian spirituality have its origin? Where does it all start? It starts in the heart of a man, the man Ignatius. So it is here where we too need to start. It was what Ignatius came to realize and experience within him while convalescing at Loyola that became the basis from which he would eventually live and help integrate everything that happened to him in his life. Let's place Ignatius. He is at this moment convalescing in bed and not being able to get hold of anything, to run away from his inner boredom. He is drawn, or perhaps we could say compelled, to start listening to his inner self. And by listening to what was taking place within him, Ignatius starts sensing that he was starting to come in contact with life. It is in our inner self that Ignatian spirituality starts to be lived, because it is from our inner self that all life is lived. So coming to this realization, Ignatius in the autobiography expresses in astonishment in these words: "What new life is this that we are now beginning? What new life is this that we are now beginning?" Beginning by listening to his inner self. When Ignatius here uses the word life, he's not referring to events or to the story of his life, but he's referring to that mystery that makes all of us human beings a living reality. And the beauty and the wonder is that we can come in contact with this mystery we call life. At this very moment, my dear brothers and sisters, each one of us here, by listening to our inner self, can come to sense whether one is living or not. It is not enough to be present here, to be living life. There have been times when somebody started his or her sharing with me in these or similar words. Father, I am dead. It is not enough to exist in order to live life. And so for Ignatius, and equal for each one of us, it is by listening to our inner self that can become the compass that will guide us on our journey through life. 3 times in the autobiography, we find him making this affirmation or something similar. What he said in this way, he felt in his heart. What he said in this way, he felt in his heart. Here within him was the compass that was guiding him in what he was doing. He was not simply following a teaching or a doctrine or an ideology. He is learning to respond. He is learning to open himself to the invitations of life by listening within him. For it is only by coming in contact with what arises within our heart that we can come in contact with life. And as Ignatius starts learning to become more and more transparent to his inner self, to the inner movements of his heart, he gradually starts noticing that there is a difference to what is taking place within him. The difference between what is life-giving and not life-giving. And so he states, at one time his eyes were opened a little, and he began to notice the difference, realizing that some thoughts left him sad and others left him happy. Ignatius here is on the verge of what I would dare call his most fundamental discovery at Loyola, and which he will eventually pass on to us. Namely, not only was he becoming aware that by listening to the inner movements of his heart, he was coming in contact with life, but he was also gradually coming to realize that the different movements in his heart was also a language through which God speaks. Contact with life opens us to contact with God. And so Ignatius, marveling at the different effects that these were having in his heart, he states, little by little, he came to recognize the difference between the spirits that agitated him, one from the demon, the other from God. Listening to one's inner self not only brings us in contact with life, but also disposes us to come in contact with God. Ignatius will still have to grow in sharpening this awareness. But it is out of this communion with his inner self that he now feels urged to move out, transforming his journey into a pilgrimage through life. It is good to note that at this point, Ignatius has not yet encountered the living God. This will happen later at Manresa. But at Loyola, he has found the road, the path that will eventually lead him to God. And this path passes through our inner self. So based on this foundational discovery, we can say, Ignatius will affirm at the very beginning of the exercises, it is not much knowledge that fills and satisfies the soul, but the inner feeling and relish of things. Here Ignatius is not only pointing out where the whole process of the exercises is to unfold, that is, in our inner self, but is also revealing the depth at which we are invited to live. My dear friends, in being invited to live in contact with the inner feeling and relish of things, we are being offered the secret how to live life, to live it fully, and to live it deeply. For it is only through this awareness and our contact with our inner self that I place myself in this unfolding process of what we call the mystery of life. In other words, I will never live life without living in contact with life. And I will never be able to live in contact with life without living in contact with my inner self. Moreover, it is by coming in contact with the way I am being affected within me at the present moment that I will be able to sense where God could be inviting me to greater fullness and deeper freedom. Our heart is the door that opens to a fullness of life and that leads to contact with God. This is why contact with one's inner self is where the whole process of Ignatian spirituality starts. Once Ignatius came to live his life rooted in his inner self, this not only placed him on the path of life, but also disposed him for an eventual liberating experience of God. And this brings me to the second point. The liberating experience of a God who sets life free. Ignatian spirituality, precisely because it is a spirituality, is meant to help us to find our fullness of life in God. Who or what is this God that Ignatius constantly keeps talking about and referring to? And what difference will this make to our life? The living source, the living spring of Ignatian spirituality is that this reality we call God can be encountered. That is, God can be personally experienced. Every encounter with God is an experience, or else it is not an encounter. And to experience is not to know, but to be touched in one's inner self. Outside the heart, there are no experiences. There are events, there are happenings. There is the story of my life. But an experience only takes place within me. And this is why living in contact with one's inner self can gradually dispose me for an encounter with God. Because every encounter with God is an experience. And the most liberating experience in the life of Ignatius came about through his encounter with God that took place at Manresa. Now, my dear friends, to be able to understand the significance and the depth and its consequence for Ignatius in his life, we need to understand a little bit what was the driving passion of his life till he experienced God. And he tells us this in the very opening words of the autobiography. His passion of life till then was simply this: his desire to win fame. He lived for this. His desire to win fame. What does this mean? That there was a longing within him, an intense desire to be recognized and considered as someone of worth in the eyes of a significant other. And so because of this passion in his life, he is driven by a passion to do outlandish things in order to try to impress others. Whether it was, as he tells us, to impress the lady of his dreams or to impress God, he was still being driven by the same passion. And my dear friends, this can only lead you to self-destruction. For the compulsion to win recognition makes you a slave and makes you blind. It was this that brought Ignatius on the verge of being killed at Pamplona. And we find him in the same situation at Manresa. Initially at Manresa, Ignatius embarks on trying to win God's favor by his own efforts, by trying to make himself acceptable in God's eyes. And my dear friends, there is nothing more painful in life, there is nothing more enslaving in life than to try to win the acceptance of someone who already loves you. This will only lead you to despair. And so it is not surprising that Ignatius comes on the verge of pondering the possibility of committing suicide, out of the despair of not being able to be at peace with himself and at peace with his God. Until when totally broken and shattered, Ignatius finally lets go of his obsession with himself and allows himself to be embraced in God's gratuitous mercy. And in that embrace, as Ignatius himself puts it, the Lord wished to awaken him as if from a dream. His words, the Lord wished to awaken him as if from a dream. Why does he say awakened from a dream? In the gratuitous embrace of God's mercy, Ignatius comes to discover what he always longed to experience and what was always his, but he had not yet come to recognize it. In the embrace of God, he comes to experience that he is someone worth in the eyes of a significant other, in the eyes of God. And there is no need to continue wasting his energy in trying to prove himself, even to God. This is so liberating, my dear friends. When you come to the point to sense you don't need to prove anything. But till then, Ignatius was blind. He was living from the illusion that he needed to prove himself in order to be accepted and win recognition. Hence the destructive compulsion to win fame in order to survive. But this will bring him only to the point of death. While in the loving embrace of God, Ignatius comes to experience himself as someone who is precious in his very being, and no one and nothing can touch that. It is this experience that now awakens him from the dream he was living so far, and is now able to start living his real life, live it freely and live it fully. And in this liberating encounter with God that drew Ignatius from the precipice of despair unto life, Ignatius comes to experience in his blood, in the marrow of his bones, a God who liberates, a God who sets life free, a God who affirms. He now experiences, as he himself puts it, a heart inflamed by God. And so from a man totally obsessed with himself, he now passionately seeks to get involved with this God that brought him from death to life. A heart inflamed by God is the Ignatian expression of what defines one's relationship with God. So whenever Ignatius uses the word God, whenever we encounter the word God in the writings of Ignatius, he is referring to this reality that liberates, that expands, that gives life. This reality whom St. Paul would say, in him we can live and move and have our being. However, my dear friends, this will not take place just by knowing God, but only by experiencing his liberating presence in one's life. Ignatius knew about God when he left Loyola for Manresa. However, the way he tried to live his relationship with this God brought him on the verge of death. And I tend to say, my dear friends, it's a bit frightening this, but it's true. If you really take God seriously in your life, and you are sincere about it, but you only know God without having experienced his presence, then God will become experienced as a burden in your life, which can also lead to guilt and to what I call a bargaining relationship with God. It is not the knowledge of God, it is the experience of God that liberates and saves. So at the very beginning of the exercises, Ignatius strongly warns the director of the exercises. Notice his words. Allow the Creator in person to deal directly with the creature, embracing him, embracing her in his love. For he knows the anguish he had gone through till he personally came to experience the liberating presence of God. This is why, my dear friends, I tend to say, we will never be able to live a real life free from the illusion that in some way I have to gain my worth and dignity unless and until we allow ourselves to be touched in the core of our being by love and come to experience what this love is revealing of me. Namely, that I am someone worth just because I am me. Ignatius discovers what God's word through the scriptures constantly try to face us with. Namely, I do not yet fully believe in the real living God until I come to believe in myself, that is, in who I am to God. And I will never be able to come to believe in who I am until I believe in the real God and experience His liberating presence. I am fully convinced, my dear friends, fully convinced that the God who brought this freedom into the heart of Ignatius has touched each one of us here. I have no doubt about it. The same God who touched the heart of Ignatius has also in your life touched you. However, if you are not in contact with your inner self, all that you notice are the footprints of God in your life. That is, you notice the signs of His presence after He has passed. But you have not seen God face to face and experienced His liberating presence. I come to the third point. The humanness of Jesus shows us the path to fullness of life in God. The experience of the spiritual exercises, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the foundation for someone who would like to walk along the Ignatian path to fullness of life in God. And at a certain stage in the process of the exercises, we are invited to ask for this grace. Interior knowledge of our Lord, who became human for me, that I may love Him and follow Him more closely. Here we are already being presented as how to approach Jesus. We are being invited to look at Jesus in His humanness. And through our intimate contact with Him, what Ignatius calls interior knowledge, we will be drawn to follow Him. To follow Him where? To follow Him where? The Gospels make us aware that Jesus came that we may have life and be able to live it to the full. So the invitation to follow Jesus more closely is meant to lead us with Jesus to this fullness of life. And the path we are invited to take with Jesus is in and through His humanness. We are invited to follow Jesus who became human for me. The humanity of Christ becomes the medium through which we unfold with Christ into our fullness. And here, it is very insightful to notice the way, the method of prayer Ignatius employs at this stage of the exercises in order to take us in this unfolding process with Jesus. At this stage in the exercises, he does not ask us to meditate or to reflect on the life of Jesus. He does not ask us to examine our life in the light of the life of Jesus. He does not ask us to apply to our life what we find inspiring in the life of Jesus, or to make any resolution or decisions to change our life. Ignatius simply invites us to a simple form of prayer where Jesus and I can become present to one another through my imagination and my heart. Ignatius invites us to be with Jesus in the mysteries of his life through my imagination, while, and this is absolutely important, becoming aware of what this my imagination is bringing to life within me, within my heart. Without this awareness, that imagination becomes simply useless fantasy, which leads to nothing, which leads to nothing. While through being aware how I am affected within me while being with Jesus in my imagination, I am being brought deeper in contact with my inner self. I am being brought in contact with what my involvement with Jesus brings to life within me. The imagination is now being rooted in the reality of my being. And then Ignatius invites us to return to and take time to stay in contact with what came to life within me while I was with Jesus. It is precisely by staying in contact with this that a transforming process starts taking place from within me. It is precisely this that starts transforming me from within into a disciple of Jesus. So the following of Jesus in Ignatian spirituality is not simply an external following, but the following of Jesus takes place by undergoing an inner transforming process in one's life towards a fullness that I'm invited to at this stage of my life. This is why, my dear friends, it is not enough to imitate Jesus. It is not enough. I need to get involved with him, and get involved with him in and through his humanness. And as I accompany Jesus in his journey to fullness of life, and Jesus tells me, follow me, he is inviting me to follow him in the very unfolding of my own life unto my fullness. As I accompany Jesus in his unfolding into total freedom, and he says, follow me, he is inviting me to follow him in the unfolding of my own life into total freedom. So when Jesus tells me, follow me, he's not simply saying, come behind me or imitate me, but he is exposing me and inviting me to live my life to the depth that he lived it, to live my life to the fullness and totality that he lived it. And we shall all meet in life with him, life in fullness, which ultimately is life in God. This is why the following of Jesus is not just some addition to one's life, but takes place in the very unfolding of my life towards deeper fullness and greater freedom. And through my contact with the humanness of Jesus, he shows us the way for this, our human life, to be lived in fullness. My dear friends, the mystery And the wonder is that as I encounter Jesus in his humanness, slowly and sacredly, I come to discover that I am being brought in contact with the divine within me. That's the mystery. What makes us fully human makes us really divine. In Ignatian spirituality, the human is the door to the divine. I now come to the last 2 points. Where and how does my unfolding to fullness of life in God take place? Where? From the spiritual exercises, we are made aware that our growing towards this fullness of life takes place in and through the concrete circumstances, the concrete situations of one's life. In other words, you do not have to move away from the context of where you are living in order to grow to one's fullness of life in God. How does Ignatius show this? The whole process of the 4 weeks of the exercises takes place between 2 movements. The movement of the principle and foundation and the movement of the contemplation to obtain love. The movement of the principle and foundation is a movement from me to God. And the movement of the contemplation to obtain love at the very end is the movement from God to me. Now, in the beginning, in the principle and foundation, Ignatius gives us a fundamental affirmation. You, I, each one of us is created for God. This is a dynamic affirmation. That is, constitutive of my being, just because of my existence, there is an orientation towards God. Anything that lives already has within it the goal it is meant to become. Any seed, a mango seed, already has within it the goal towards which it is called to become, the mango tree. And this is true for each one of us. Constitutive of our being is our orientation to the divine, to God. And this is why moving towards God unfolds me towards my fullness, or what Ignatius calls saving one's soul. So unfolding towards God brings us to our fullness, while at the same time, growing into our fullness opens me in the direction of God. There is no competition between God and my fullness. On the other hand, at the end of the exercises, we are presented with God's movement towards us, human beings. Because for Ignatius, creation is God's labor of love. God is lovingly reaching out to us, which, as in all love, is also an expression of the desire to become one with the one one loves, we human beings. Now, central to all this is the Ignatian conviction that both these movements, from me to God and from God to me, both these movements take place through the same concrete situations of my life. When Ignatius talks of my movement to God, he states, the things on the face of the earth are created as helps to the pursuit of one's end. And Ignatius uses the same words when he talks of God's movement to us. He states, God labors and works for me in all the creatures on the face of the earth. The Ignatian conviction is that everything that affects us, everything that touches us, everything that surrounds us can play a part in the pursuit of my fullness, can play a part in my unfolding towards God. While also everything that affects us, everything that touches us, everything that surrounds us is also the medium through which God reaches out to us. In other words, my dear friends, it is useless to try to seek fullness of one's life outside the very context, the very reality that one is living. And it is an illusion to try to open oneself to God by running away from the reality of one's life. Our unfolding movement towards God and God's reaching out to us both take place in and through the same concrete situations of my life. What does this imply? That everything that is part of my life, everything that I have experienced, everything that has happened to me in the story of my life, pleasant or unpleasant, positive or negative, can become a stepping stone in my unfolding towards the fullness of life, can become a stepping stone in my unfolding towards my destiny in God. You do not have to deny anything of what has happened to you. You do not have to run away from anything that has taken place in your life in order to live and breathe life. And this is why in the unfolding journey of my life, there is always hope. Whatever has taken place in my life, positive or negative, need not be an obstacle to continuing my unfolding into fullness of life. And so also nothing need block me from continuing my relationship with God. Life, and so also God, denies nothing, rejects nothing, and can integrate everything. And this hope is even strengthened by the Ignatian affirmation and fight in the exercises that God labors and works in all things. I tend to say that in the whole literature of Christian spirituality, this is the only place where we find this reference for God who labors, who works, yes, even in the Bible, in the New Testament, we find God works, but that God labors. And Ignatius repeats it twice. He acts in the manner of one who is laboring. It is the Ignatian conviction that nothing, absolutely nothing, that affects me, that affects our history, that surrounds us in the world, that is not touched by the laboring presence of God. And my dear friends, the surest sign of the laboring presence of God is precisely where creation, where history, where humanity is still wounded. Because it is precisely where creation, humanity is still wounded, that God is still laboring. Or else there is no need for Him to continue laboring. And this is why in mission we enter into points where there is brokenness, where there is sin, where there is injustice, where there is poverty. Because it is the surest sign God is still laboring there. God in creating did not produce a product, but launched a process. And God is still very much part of this process. This is why I say, my struggles, my tears, are not just only my tears, but are also part of the laboring presence of God with me, struggling with me, as I seek to grow into my fullness. Having talked about the context where our unfolding into life takes place, I now conclude with how. How to make this happen. And here we come what I call the Ignatian pedagogy for a person who wants to live according to Ignatian way of life. And here again I find this in the spiritual exercises. Underlying the method of prayer that Ignatius presents us from the second stage of the exercises, what has come to be known as the Ignatian contemplation. Underlying this method of prayer, there is actually a way of living which Ignatius is applying to the process of prayer. In this process of prayer, what is known as Ignatian contemplation, we find 4 steps. First, we are invited to get involved with Jesus through our imagination in the mysteries of his life. Second, we are asked to become aware how I am affected while I am involved with Jesus. As I told you, without this awareness, it's just fantasy. Having become aware how am I affected, then I am invited, third step, to stay in touch with what has affected me while being with Jesus. And this starts bringing about a transformation from within me. And finally, at the end of spending 4 hours of prayer, at the end of the day, Ignatius tells us, can you get a sense of the overall feeling you are left with? And let yourself be absorbed and soaked by this in every part of your being. And now, what you experienced is becoming you, is becoming yours. This is the process of prayer he takes us. Now, underlying this process is a way of living through these 4 steps. My dear friends, give yourself totally and get involved in whatever you are doing. Teaching, working, praying, playing, relaxing, reading, singing. Get involved. Give yourself totally to whatever you are doing. Second step, be aware how you are being affected while you are involved. Be aware how you are affected while you are being involved. Without that awareness, you are not yet living life, but life is passing you by. Get involved, be aware how you are affected, and then the third step, learn to stay in touch with what came alive within you. Only in this way you will be nourished, or else you will walk through life with an empty heart till you die, seeking substitutes to fill you. There is no other way to nourish your inner self. Staying in touch with what came alive within you. And in the process, what destroys life is also purified from you. And finally, at the end of your involvement, at the end of all that you do, at the end of your day, can you get a sense, what are you left with after finishing this work? What are you left with within you after completed this task, met this person, before you go to sleep at the end of the day? What are you left with? and allow that inner feeling like to soak and flow into your being, which becomes the basis like from which you move on in life. This is why Ignatius at the very beginning of the exercises tells us it is not much knowledge that fills and satisfies, but the inner feeling and relish of things. In those words, he is presenting us with the key for anyone who wants to live the Ignatian path to life. It is by making this a way of life that I come to live fully, live deeply, and also, my dear friends, start slowly opening up and nourishing the contemplative dimension of my life. For please allow me to say, being a contemplative ultimately does not simply depend on how much you pray, but on how deeply you live. And when I come to live from a certain depth, I have opened that sacred space within me where I can live in communion with the divine presence in whatever I do. God bless you.